caring for our land. Growing our essentials. Cultivating our future. Every producer leaves a legacy. Our Amazing Grasslands.
And stepping back on the ranch, it just brings solace. Kind of clears your mind. I can't really explain the warm feeling that it brings to me. A feeling that just goes right from your head to your toes.
We are at the Dutton Ranch in southern Perkins County here in South Dakota. This ranch has been in our family for 3 generations. My granddad homesteaded it here in 1915. My father was born in 1927, and he, of course, was always part of the ranch and lived on the ranch in his entire life. And he operated it until he retired in 2007. In 2010, I retired from my position as an educator and school administrator, and then I've been on the ranch since that time, and I've been the primary manager and running livestock, primarily Angus beef, and we run Hereford bulls, and we're a cattle producer, and we sell calves to the feedlots generally. My brother Dave and my brother Darrell are also owners of the ranch. We have it in a Dutton Ranch LLC, and I lease the ranch from the LLC.
I'm currently the secretary of the LLC, so I do the minutes because I'm the retired city finance officer in Spearfish, and so, you know, I'm quite familiar with doing that type of work, so it ended up just falling on my shoulders. I very firmly believe that we are just stewards, and our grandparents and our parents who had passed this ranch down to us, and it needs to pass on in a better condition than we received it. If you manage a ranch conservationally, you're going to get way more out of it than if you abuse the land and then you have to wait for it to recover. And so you don't overuse it, you manage it, you rotate your herd. You know, you think it's a sacrifice, but it really isn't. It's a benefit.
My dad was instrumental. He was back 20 years ago, he was the regional range manager of the year on some of his conservation practices that he used. One of the things that he started doing was doing a lot of cross fencing and breaking the big pastures down into section-sized pastures. I have continued with that cross fencing. He didn't get all the pastures broken up into these 400 and 500 acre pastures, which we feel is pretty good for the number of head of livestock that we run. That's what we've done primarily as far as the grazing management. We want to leave the land as good or better than how we received it. One of the things that my dad always did, and I've continued that practice, is trying to reserve some areas for the wildlife and the birds, species. The Dutton Dam was actually built in 1935 as a WPA dam, and then it was washed out in 1951. And then my dad, he worked with Ducks Unlimited on a land easement where he allowed them 30 years use of the surrounding property of that land where it couldn't be grazed at all.
Once it was done, it just was an amazing addition to our property. We fenced it off so it would never have livestock around it, or only if they crawled in. And it's great habitat for birds and for all of our local animals.
Nothing I enjoy more than seeing the deer and the antelope and the varieties of birds, upland grouse and partridge, as well as the ducks and geese that nest here. And we want to share our land, our ranch with all those other species too. By fencing off areas that are heavily used by those species of wildlife and not allowing the cattle to overgraze. If we didn't have the river fenced off, the cattle would spend all their time in the heat of the summer right next to the river, and it would kill all the willows, and they would tromp out a lot of the native species that typically are along those drainages.
When my parents had started a great estate planning, they had started turning over land to us long before they were even thinking about retiring. And so they were transferring the maximum value over to us kids early on. And by the time that, they were going into nursing homes, etc., there was only 60 acres of this ranch left that were not in the children's name. And we bought those 60 acres from them and ended up now that we as a family, as siblings, own the place. And we knew that we needed to do something to make it easier to manage. And therefore we formed it into a partnership LLC. And the fun thing about our family is it was instilled in us about family matters. And we were taught very strong work ethics. Well, first I would do research with attorneys and find an attorney that has a lot of experience setting up either trusts or LLCs. Because there's different ways you can go about it. LLC made the most sense to us. Someone that specializes in land preservation and land, in family ranching or farming. And then you have to sit down as a family and brainstorm with the pros and the cons to determine, what is your long-term goal. When we set up our LLC, our long-term goal was conservation and the preservation of the land for future generations. We're losing the open space, and we don't know what it's going to look like 200 years from now, but this ranch will remain the same.
What a beautiful place in southern Perkins County where the Duttons are doing an amazing job stewarding our grasslands. It's really awesome to see people that have moved away from the ranch and had successful careers come back thinking that it's going to be some sort of a sacrifice to really realize that it's actually just a wonderful blessing. Coming up, we'll visit the Limpert Ranch near Buffalo, South Dakota, where they have a little bit of a different grazing animal. They raise bison. Through a couple of generations of cross fencing and starting to really get into the rotational grazing aspect of raising bison, they realized many, many benefits.
Jackie and I knew way back what we were doing was not sustainable. We did a custom farming, custom haying, sheep, cattle operation, and I felt like I was 60 years old when I was 25. I knew we couldn't keep doing it. I knew the ranch wasn't making money. I wanted our kids to stay here and be part of the operation, and that we couldn't afford to do that if we kept doing the sheep and cattle thing. My wife Jackie and son Brody and daughter-in-law Samantha help run the operation. Brody and Samantha have 4 little kids as well, 7 on down to 1, and we hope to make them a big part of the operation when they get a little older.
About 10 years ago, we moved into this rotational grazing practice, and basically what we did is cross-fence the whole ranch into 30-some pastures other than our calving pasture. We have one calving pasture that's about 5,000 acres, and we turn our cows in there for the months of April, May, and into June, and they calve there, and then we start our actual rotation where we're moving from pasture to pasture, which are section size.
We run the buffalo herd all in one large herd, as opposed to splitting them up into smaller groups. We'll hit these pastures hard for a few days. They're only in a pasture 5, 6, 7 days, depending on the size of the pasture.
We've seen tremendous improvements in the ground by doing that. You know, before we cross-fenced the whole ranch, you know, like I said, we have 30-some pastures now. Before we did that, we essentially had 5 or 6, 7 pastures that were just huge. And what we're seeing now is, you know, by cross-fencing that and making those animals utilize every bit of the ground, you know, they're utilizing the grasses that they wouldn't in a larger pasture. You know, buffalo tend to like, you know, native ground and warm, cool season grasses. And, you know, by doing what we did, we basically made them cover each pasture and, you know, graze all the grass instead of just what they liked.
You'll come out of these pastures and after a month they've regrown and you can't hardly tell that they've been grazed. We see warm season grasses coming in that I haven't seen for years. So I mean, we're on to something here. My only regret is that we didn't do this 30 years ago.
You know, before we had the ranch fenced like we do now, we essentially had, you know, a fall pasture, a summer pasture, a spring pasture, and, you know, they would just really be intensive on certain areas of ground, and, you know, they were really working the perimeters of pastures and wanting new ground all the time, where when you're moving them every, you know, 5, 6 days, they're happier. You know, they got fresh water, fresh grass. We don't have near the issues of them breaking out of pastures or, you know, anything like that. So I think the overall animal health and happiness would be the biggest thing that we've seen.
We started going to some holistic range management classes, and that really opened up a whole new world to us on what we can achieve with our pasture management.
My mom and dad and wife went to several of these classes years and years ago, and it was a hard thing to buy into. You know, it didn't make sense. It's not what Dad did, it's not what Grandpa did, it's that whole idealism of, you know, changing your train of thought. One of my favorite pickup lines that I ever remember from one of those classes is, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always have what you've always had. So just that idea of changing and doing things different, and it's worked well for us. Yeah, part of the holistic management is the theory of mob grazing. So like here on the ranch, we basically call it 1,000 animal units that we move pasture to pasture, and it varies, you know, from time of year, but everything from their, you know, you put 1,000 animal units on 500 acres, you know, depending on the year, just everything from their, you know, their feet action on the ground, and you know, they're urinating and defecating, and just the fertilizer and the hoof action that works up that soil, and it brings grasses on that otherwise, if it wasn't managed that way, it, you know, you see grasses that you wouldn't see if it was managed other ways.
One statistic that's pretty interesting is for every 1% of organic matter improvement in the soil will hold 1.5 gallons more water. It doesn't take much improvement to make a load of difference. Every section of ground has at least one reservoir, dam, and 5 tire tanks. So the wildlife has a tremendous amount of water resources, and that's what the main thing lacking here in Hardin County is. We've seen the deer numbers increase, we've seen the bird population increase, the grouse. We're actually seeing some elk moving in through the ranch now. We see them quite regularly, so it's a natural thing for them to migrate to grass that's being managed like this, because it's like a free smorgasbord for them. It's not every ranching operation that not only can afford to have their kids home, but have a tremendous future. So with everything we do, the whole conservation side of it, the development of pastures and water and all the resources, Brody and Samantha have been a big part of it, as Jackie has. We couldn't have done it without them. We're very fortunate to have them here. I mean, I can't wait till our grandkids are my age and they'll see a tremendous change in this ranch.
Out of high school, my dad was very pragmatic about preparing me for life, and you know, there's a lot of people who begged their kids to come home. My dad said, you're not just going to come home and farm. He said you should go get a degree and get a job, get some experience, and if you still want to come home and farm, then you can. And so I went to USD for my undergrad, graduated, took my commission in the Marine Corps, and went on active duty and deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And then in 2012, I left active duty as a captain and then came home to start farming with my dad. And I also went back to school, went to grad school at SDSU, farmed with Dad, and then we started transitioning to me having all the farm about 2 years ago. I'm John Schubeck from Centerville, South Dakota, and I've got 4 kids, and then my wife Megan. Megan works in town at the school, and my kids are 10, 8, 5, and then we've got a newborn. When I went to SDSU, because I'd just come out of the Marine Corps, my life was focused on IEDs and deployments, learning the trade of combat and protecting our country. So I was kind of a clean slate when I left active duty and I went to SDSU, and they started talking about this thing, no-till, you know, and they started talking about rotational grazing and all these things that really intrigued me. And growing up, I was so focused on athletics that, you know, I wasn't Mr. Farmer, Mr. immersed in die-hard farming practices one way or the other. And I just did what Dad told me to do. I'd go run a tractor or pick rocks or fix fence or whatever. I never was interested in the why until I left active duty and went to grad school. That started getting me excited about the why. I just got really interested in sustainable practices and how to maintain the land. It wasn't just about maintaining the land. That's a fun plus, but it's enhanced our profitability. It was kind of, again, a practical decision. I always enjoyed the cattle more growing up because I have always been such an active person that turning circles on a tractor is not necessarily the most exciting thing in the world for me. It just fit, you know, ever since I was a kid. I really liked cattle, but living in southeast South Dakota, having a ranch is not super practical, but I was fortunate enough to be able to get rental pastures and really make that expand. I really think there's a lot more opportunity for that than people let on, because there's a lot of pasture out there and there's not a lot of people fighting over it. Most of the people that are in the cattle world, they don't want to take on building fences or, you know, taking on a problem pasture that might not have everything intact, where you might have to put some sweat equity into it to make it work. And that's where I made a lot of headway, is just taking on some of those pastures that other people were turning away from. And I was willing to put in some sweat equity and build some fence or something along those lines. I guess the biggest advice I'd give about the economic opportunity is the only person that should tell you no is yourself. You just go out there and knock on a door. I don't know how many doors I've knocked on and said, hey, I see your pasture's unused. Are you doing anything with that? Do you have any plan for that. You know, I've never taken pasture from anybody. I've always found pasture that's totally unused. Every piece of pasture I've got, there was something going on where the previous renter was no longer there, or whatever the case, hadn't been rented for 30 years or something, and nobody wanted to deal with the fence or the grass. I just go in there, I would make up Word documents or spreadsheets with a proposal and just say, hey, I'll build this fence for you. You know, if you just give me a lease, this is what I can put into it, this is what I think it'll cost me, and I'll build this fence for you. I would say sustainable practices reduce my stress level because I don't have all my eggs in one basket, which is awesome. You know, we've had a really dry spring and everything I'm doing is really helping out with that. I know that my pastures are just fine. They've got lots of cover and adequate moisture, you know, even though we haven't hardly gotten any rain. And same thing with the crop fields. They've got tons of moisture there, but also just having diversity. I've got small grains, I've got alfalfa. I don't just have corn and soybeans. I've got cattle where if one thing is down, you know, the oil market is down right now and everything's tied to oil in the crop sector. Well, I've got cattle and I've got oats and I've got alfalfa, and it really helps to tamp down the worrying when you've got diversity. I always say that I never want to fully retire. I always want to have something on my plate. And my grandpa, he was fixing fence at 97 years old, and he'd come out and help me with little things. Or if I was gone, I remember one time my grandpa was 96 and the cows got out, and my wife's got 3 kids and it's just her, and grandpa came and helped and got the cows back in, and you know, that'd be kind of the way I'd like to do it. He lived to 99. I just think having something to do that you enjoy keeps you young, you know.
From the northwest corner of the state all the way down to the southeast corner of the state by Centerville, we've seen producers doing amazing things for our grasslands. But at Homegrown, we can think of nothing better than to salute those that have sacrificed everything to go and serve their country.